All right, take your Bibles, turn to Obadiah. Obadiah. What chapter are we up to in Obadiah? Good, just want to see if you're paying attention. It is the last one. It is the first one. It's not the one in the middle. It is the verses in the middle though, yes. Obadiah, just want to look at the middle verses tonight. I won't read all of Obadiah. We read that last week. I'll just read the part that we're going to look at this evening. I'll just refresh your memory that there's three basic ways you can break this book of Obadiah down. One is the judgment that's pronounced on them, that God will bring them down because of their pride. Then the middle section is the reason for that judgment. And then the last section is the blessings upon Israel, and the prophecies that are mentioned about the good things that have happened to Israel, the judgment upon Edom, but the blessings upon Israel. But the middle section here, the reason for the judgment, and verses 10 down to verse 16 says this: For thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that thou stoodest in the other side, and the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou wast as one of them. But thou shouldest not have looked on the day of thy brother, in the day that he became a stranger. Neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither shouldest thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall be upon thine own head. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yea, they shall drink, and they shall swallow down, and they shall be as though they had not been. We'll just leave off our reading there. One thing that I realised, and I knew it but didn't click until a couple of weeks ago when we were at the end of Amos. But Amos is quoted in the book of Acts in chapter number 7. And it says there that when it is being presented, it says, and the book of the prophets, as the book of the prophets says. So it's one book, and it's called the book of the prophets. It doesn't say that as Amos says, but as in it's written in the book of the prophets. That's because in the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Old Testament, which is the Old Testament, the Hebrew, which is broken down into three sections. The last section is known as the 12. It's the last 12 books of the Old Testament are actually one book. Which is an interesting way of looking at them, because when we have them here before us, they're sort of individual books. But if you package them into one book and think of them as 12 chapters of one book, like they fit together, it's an interesting way of looking at them. And there is a common theme that's woven through them. One of those common themes is found in verse number 15. It says, for the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. The day of the Lord, does anybody remember anything about the day of the Lord? It is judgment. It's a judgment, but it's judgment primarily upon, it's mentioned numerous times, it's a judgment upon, does anybody remember where the judgment is upon on the day of the Lord? It's actually not Israel. It ultimately is the judgment upon the nations and the Gentile nations. Though he starts out, the day of the Lord is depicted in different forms, it's like it progressively gets worse. Every day of the Lord, if the judgment comes, and it was like the locust. Remember in Joel, that was the day of the Lord. But the locust came, didn't really compare truly to what they pictured when Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldean army came and did way more damage than the locust did. So that day of the Lord ultimately was worse. But when God ultimately comes and his judgment comes, is even a greater day of the Lord. So it's like every day of the Lord, which is the judgment of God, gets progressively worse. And you look back on that judgment and think, man, the one previous, what we thought was bad, we thought the locusts were bad, this is worse. But it's the judgment ultimately upon the nations. And if you want to take that even a step further, the ultimate day of the Lord is when you stand before God and he has in his hand the gavel of eternal judgment and eternity is meted out. And when that judgment of eternal death and damnation is given before God, that's an eternal sentence and no reversing it. That ultimately is worse than anything the Chaldeans could have done, anything that the locusts would have done, and any other day of the Lord that preceded it. They will be worse. But it's ultimately upon the day of the Lord is ultimately upon the Gentiles, and it mentions that throughout Isaiah and Ezekiel as well as in these minor prophets, the day of the Lord. But this Obadiah is written to the Edomites, and the Edomites, of course, are not Gentiles, they're not Jews, they are Gentiles. They are even though they are from Esau's line, the Edomite line, they are not Jews. And so here is a picture again of the heathen, and they're a picture of the heathen and the judgment of God that comes upon them. And the heathen are so lifted up in their pride, the nations against God, they're lifted up in their pride, and they're saying, God, hey, who's going to ever bring us down? We are the greatest nation. Our kingdom will never come to an end. There's a psalm, as I say that comes to my mind. I can't remember exactly where it is, but it talks about the rich, and the rich establish their name, and the way the psalmist says it is that it doesn't come into their mind that they think that their name will continue forever. That what I'm building will be here forever, and my name, but rich people come and mighty men come upon the earth, and they are here for a moment, and when they die, their name and their legacy might go on for a few generations, even if they are a great name and very wealthy, but ultimately their name comes to an end, and they're just relegated to the annals of history, and they're done. And nations are the exact same way. Nations come to an end. And as much as they think, man, we're going to be here forever, but there's never been a nation yet that has been here forever. They rise, and then they peak, and then they fall. And the next nation comes up, and no nation thinks that they're ever going to fall. And here is the Edomites picturing here the Gentiles and the heathens, and they're thinking, man, we're never going to be brought down. We have just set ourselves in a way that we're going to be here forever in this rocks. No one's going to defeat us from this position where they were. They're in Petra, Jordan, in the Jordan area. They're on the east side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea in that particular part of the world, and they just thought, man, our geography and where we are, we're just not going to be defeated here. We're going to go forever. God says, I'm going to bring you down, which is the same thing as what he does to all the nations. He's going to bring them down ultimately. But the thing that we just look at really quickly tonight is the reason for it. The reason for it is their lack of mercy. It's ultimately their lack of mercy. There's a Psalm 2. Does anybody know what Psalm 2 says? It's a famous question in Psalm 2. Why do the heathen rage? Yes. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? And it's a psalm that David writes because no doubt there were those around him that said, oh, we hate David. Man, we don't want him to be the king. But ultimately it's a prophecy, it's a messianic prophecy about Jesus because ultimately they hate Jesus. And it's why do the heathen rage against Jesus? And then at the very end of it says, kiss the Son lest he be angry. It's the kiss of homage. Bow the knee to the king, for he is who God has chosen. And David is saying, why are you hating me? God has ultimately chosen me to be king. Therefore, pay homage. It's not, don't hate me. God put me here. And Jesus is the same. That you can hate him as much as you want and despise him, but ultimately he is God approved and God appointed. So you may as well bow the knee because you're not going to get past God, and he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So they say, why do the heathen rage? Why are you fighting against this? But they do. They fight against God. But here I'd like to say this. I'd ask this question. Why do the heathen rejoice? Because it's pretty much the same thing. As much as David, when David was in power and the nation of Israel was going well, guess what? The heathen and the enemies, they raged. They hated it. Oh, I hate to see Israel doing well. I hate to see Israel winning victories and to see their kingdom blessed under this great King David. And they raged at it. They hated it. It burned within them the hatred and the animosity. But when Israel is collapsed and Nebuchadnezzar comes and destroys them and wipes them out, now they're rejoicing. It says that here in verse number 12. But thou shouldest not have looked on the day of thy brother and the day that he became a stranger, neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. They rejoiced. They rejoiced at it. Go to Psalm 137. You probably know this verse. Psalm 100, maybe you do on a Wednesday night. People may know this more than on a Sunday morning. But Psalm 137. It's ultimately about Babylon, and it's a wonderful prophecy about Babylon. Ties into Revelation, the past, the present, the future of Babylon, and what God will ultimately do. And you can read Psalm 137 in light of Revelation. There's quite a correlation between them. But you know it, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down. And but he goes on in all of this, while in their sadness of their defeat of Babylon, verse 7 says, remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, which, as you notice there, is not R-A-I, it's R-A-S. It's like raise it, it means completely flatten it, completely destroy it, wipe it out. And they're saying, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. I mean, they just stood by, wringing their hands when Nebuchadnezzar came, and they thought this is the greatest day of their life. It's strange to think. Blue tells the story of the old, was it Serbian, Croatian, the drunk guy up north, used to be there, and he'd been out for 13, 15 years or something like that. And this Croatian guy, living here in Australia, working up north, would get drunk, and when he'd get drunk at night, then he'd start going on about the Serbs or whoever, the Croats, or he was Serbian, going on about the Croats or whatever it was, yeah. And it wasn't just what they did in his lifetime. It's about stuff that was like hundreds of years ago. And there he's going on about it here, living on the other side of the world. And there are nations like that. We don't really have that here in Australia. We don't have the Ukraine, apparently. Yeah. But there are nations all around the place who have deep animosity against each other. Our closest neighbours are New Zealanders, but we don't really have the same animosity between Australians and New Zealanders. It's a very cordial relations between New Zealand and Australia here, but other countries don't have that. Man, there's deep-seated hatred. I watched a video, just came up on the YouTube Shorts, and there was this Jewish guy, and he was in the car with this girl, and he was chatting with her, and he was chatting with her, and he says, why don't you come along? They're on a first date or something, and they're videoing or whatever he's doing it. And he says, why don't you come along to Shabbat or to the Sabbath celebrations this week? And she stopped. She said, are you a Jew? And he said, are you not a Jew? Are you not a Jew? She's like, I'm a Palestinian. And instantly, they were like, and she just quietly just opens the car door and gets out. But up until that point, he thought she was a Jew and she thought he was a Palestinian, and they were all fine up until that point, till he realized that she was a Palestinian and she realized that he was a Jew. Then it's like, deal breaker, because of the animosity. because of the animosity between those people groups and those two nations that are, or people, yeah, really people groups, not so much nations, but people groups right next to each other. The animosity ran very, very deep. And the Croat, what I was saying before, he'd go on about that when he'd get drunk, about what was taking place all these years before, and they hold it to the generations passed down until it becomes so interwoven into a very culture and a people's identity is to despise and to hate, And those Arab nations around Israel, it's bred into them from their schooling all the way up to hate Israel and hate the Jews. And there's great, deep animosity there. Tim Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, he says about forgiveness, and the chapter is called the True Meaning of the Cross. And he talks about forgiveness, that all forgiveness is costly suffering. That if you're going to forgive someone, it's not just that you just say, I forgive you, and you walk on your way and you go and you part ways and everything's good. Is that when you forgive someone, you really are bearing what they've done to you all over again. It's like you are saying, I'm not going to make you pay for what you've done. I'm going to bear the pain myself. Because until that point, you have the tit for tat. You have someone that offends someone and does something wrong, and then the other person says, right, and they might say, oh, yeah, no, that's all right. But no, it's still simmering away inside, and so person A, who has offended person B now simmers away and says, oh yeah, it's fine on the surface, but it's still there. And then what they want to do though, is they want to see the same amount of hurt or retribution attributed back to them. So if they've lost something in it, whether they've lost money and they've lost X amount of money, this person wants to see the other person lose the same amount or more. I want to see them lose even more money than they made me lose. If it's reputation, if it's a job promotion, and they've come and taken the job, and this person has had taken the job from them, and they feel like they've lost a position, then they want to see that person lose that position and lose their job and see their life fail. That's the tit-for-tat nature of unforgiveness, that we always want to raise it. But he says what happens is that it always, person A does something to person B, then person B does something back to them, but worse. And then it gets worse, and it escalates, and wars come out of all of this. He says, as unforgiveness goes, he says, the evil spreads. And he says, it's not just that it spreads externally, he says, but it also spreads internally. And so whatever that unforgiveness was turns into bitterness and hatred against that person or people groups. If a young lady and a young girl has been abused by an older man or maybe a man of a particular ethnicity, then all of a sudden there can be a hatred and an animosity towards all people of that ethnicity. It comes into it starts being woven into their very character, this unforgiveness, and the heart starts to harden in pride because of this. No, I'm not forgiving. No, they've done me wrong, and they probably have done wrong. But to forgive, there has to be this costly suffering, because you have to say to that person in your mind, I'm not going to make you pay for what you've done. I'm going to bear it myself. But bearing it again is like living the pain all over again. It's just as painful to go down this path. But as Tim Keller rightfully says, he says that's what Jesus does on the cross. That instead of making us pay for our sins and offenses against God, he bears it himself. And instead of making us pay it, he bears it himself. And it is a cross. It's an agony that you go through, but it's going through the cross that brings about the resurrection and new life. And forgiveness, though it is like going through the cross, and it is a costly, painful way, it is ultimately that what brings about new life and a resurrection into new life. But all of that is is for what they had here, because they were so angry against the Edomites, because there was such a generational hatred and animosity that was passed down, it became interwoven into their character. And as much as Esau and Jacob sort of seem like they got along okay for a bit, right, that animosity grew. And if you were to go read the story when Israel was coming out of Egypt and they were to come through the Edomites, and they said, can we pass through here? We won't touch any of your water. We won't drink your water. We won't touch any of your food. We won't touch anything. We will stick to the highway, and we will just go through the main highway to our destination of where we're going. And they came back and said no. And they said, please, we won't touch anything. And they said, and the Edomites, instead of just saying no a second time, came out with force to the border and with the army and says, you are not passing through here. Thou shalt not pass. It predates anything that Tolkien ever came up with to say that, but they did. Thou shalt not pass. You'll not go through here. That was the animosity. We ain't helping you. That was the Edomites before they even went in. And that animosity went on the way through. To this point, it became so a part of their character, the unforgiveness and the bitterness became such a part of their character, and coupled with their proud, haughty heart, this is how they started to act. When bad things happened to the person that they hated, man, they loved it. They thought, this is fantastic. This is the greatest day. This is fantastic. Raise it. Burn the place. Destroy everything. And they were in on it. And it says here that when the Jews started to run and flee from Nebuchadnezzar, and they were fleeing east because they couldn't go west because the sea is over there, so they're trying to flee east across the Jordan, across the Dead Sea, and flee away from the invading army of Nebuchadnezzar, they are met with the Edomites, and they said they stood in the way. They stood on the other side in the day that they were carried away, and they stopped them. They said, no, we're holding you. Hey, the army, come get them. They're over here. And they blocked their exit. And when they hid, it says that they delivered them up. They were hiding amongst the rocks, and there's a group of Jews over here hiding in the rocks around Jordan, and they tell the armies, oh, you might want to go look over here. They're over there. That's how they lived. And they loved it to see that their enemy, the Israel, their brothers were getting destroyed, and they loved every part of it. And no doubt it's the flesh that appealed to them. In fact, it says here, when they were giving out the, where is it? Giving out the booty, giving out the on their substance, verse 13, nor should not have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it, and they were ransacking the place and taking the loot from their win, well, here are the Edomites as well saying, hey, you should pay us as well because we were helping you win this victory and we were here telling you where they were. And so there they are trying to lay claim as well and get the stuff as well. That's who the Edomites were. And God said, I see this. And I see how much you hate my people, and you are rejoicing at their downfall. But God says this, but you should not have stood in the crossway to cut off those that did escape. And he says, the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. And it's this lack of mercy. It's the lack of mercy that we learn out of here, that God does not take kindly to those who have a lack of mercy. And it's a tough thing at times to show mercy and to have mercy. And we know it at times, whatever our situations are and whoever it might be, it's tough. And it takes a lot of grace of God to be merciful. And the Edomites did not have the mercy nor the grace of God for that kindness towards their enemy. We'll leave off there and we'll have a look at the rest of it next week. Find a prayer